So we're here again with Dr. Michael Eldred, who's currently coming to us from Germany. My name is Katina Michael. I'm currently in Australia, and together Michael and I are going to continue our second part of our conversation. The first part was fascinating. I know I've listened to the recording several times and taken so many notes from Michael's presentation. I was just saying to him a moment ago that his mathematical mind and his love of philosophy coming together give us this joy of presentation of these dense books, these amazing philosophical works over the ages, and to have someone provide those in bite chunks for the next generation is quite wonderful, as I feel very spoiled when I listen to his work again. Last talk, we heard Michael talk about interplay and movement and the fact that people are beings, they're not subjects or objects. And we contrasted this with technology and technoscience. And today we're going to hear a little bit more. This presentation will be broadcast in the International Symposium on Technology and Society. That's the international conference that Arizona State University is hosting this year, of which I'm a part of. And the conversation continues. I don't know how many of these we'll do, Michael, but I'm open to a number of them, actually. I'm feeling very comfortable learning from you and listening to you. But let's start off with perhaps a small recap on your behalf of where we spoke about, what we spoke about last time, and perhaps where we want to go today.
Well, what did we speak about? We spoke about the ontology of productive movement. And I contrasted it with the ontology of another kind of movement that has not been noticed or not been taken up by the entire philosophical tradition. And I introduced this concept of interplay. And interplay is a completely different kind of movement that cannot be captured by this ontology of productive movement. It requires that we take people, the people in this interplay, as players, and I call them who. They are each player in this game or this interplay is a who, and this contrasts quite starkly with the ontology of productive movement that is concentrated on mastery over the movement of things. And that's the news of what we were talking about the last time.
It's come up in conversation so many times in different interviews I've participated in. I keep mentioning you, Michael, because that is, I think, an excellent foundation for understanding the phenomena that we are seeing all around us today, particularly in this notion of a contactless and frictionless society that's being pushed almost on us now. You know, this extra care that we have to take, this technology that now that is like intervening in our everyday transactions, in our everyday processes. For a moment, can we go back, and maybe I should ask you this, why is it necessary to go back to the ontological drawing board to question the ontology we inherited from Plato and Aristotle? Why should we question it?
Yeah, to put it very briefly, we have a very developed ontology of productive movement, and it's concentrated on things, on what's. And what I contrast it with is an ontology of who-ness. And this who-ness has the focus on people as players in an interplay with each other, which is also a movement. And it is also has to be conceived as a power play. But these powers that are put to work when we are in interplay with one another are basically, in the first place, and most elementarily, they are our own powers and abilities. And this, I found the point of access to this by, first of all, studying Marx and this so-called value form analysis in the first part of Capital, where you have these famous so-called dialectic of the value form. But it goes right back to Plato and Aristotle, of course. You have the first analysis of what exchange, which is a kind of interplay, consists in Aristotle, in the 5th book of the Nicomachean Ethics. And there you find this distinction between use value and exchange value. Aristotle doesn't actually introduce those terms, but he talks about the two possible uses of a shoe. He says that a shoe can be used. You know, you put a shoe on, it's something that is good for walking in, and you need shoes to walk comfortably over the earth. That's the use value. But he says it also has a second use, which is not its proper use. It can be used to exchange the shoe for something else, such as a bag of wheat or a book or whatever. And this is what Marx calls exchange value. So that when we exchange one thing for another, and we do that through the medium of money, this money is mediating the coming together of two different useful things: shoe, wheat, bread, whatever, or a smartphone, doesn't matter what it is, but these things are put into a kind of equivalence through the money, in which it also gains a quantitative determination, because things have a price, and a price is always quantitative. And when you consider this more deeply, then you see that what is going on behind these things, which seem to have value in themselves, say a shoe in a shop has a value, a smartphone in the next shop also has a value, and it's expressed in price. You see that these two completely different things have an equivalence through the price they have, and this price expresses the value of the things quantitatively. So Marx speaks in this first chapter of so-called commodity fetishism. And according to this fetishism, it seems that the value of these things, say a shoe and a smartphone, they seem to have value in themselves, of themselves. And this he calls a fetishism, because behind the things, this thingified value, and thingified itself is a very interesting word. If you look up the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find that you have the word thing, of course, thingify, thingification, and this has normally been translated into English from the German word Verdinglichung as reification. And reification is probably a more unfamiliar word. I mean, to reify, reification has become known under this this word instead of using a more Germanic word, thingify or thingification. So value is thingified in things that seem to have a value in themselves. But if you look behind that, you see that what's happening in the exchange of these thingified values is that there are powers and abilities of people who have produced these things with the help of the natural powers provided by the earth. So you have these two sources of what makes it possible for a thing to be produced, but not just produced, but also to enter into these exchange relations with each other. And I think if you just take the thingified value and leave it as it is, and just take that as a fact, and it is a fact that things have value, they have a price, and that money is the universal equivalent that can buy anything which is on the market. And they might be just commodity things, but it goes all the way to you can buy someone's reputation, you can bribe somebody, you can bribe a bureaucrat in the States for, to do something to your advantage. If you look at it simply on those terms, then it just seems to be a kind of economic thing. So you have economics. And economics is content with just dealing with the things. And so you have a very standard definition of the social science of economics. It says economics is the science that investigates the distribution of scarce resources so that they are employed productively and efficiently. And you have this focus of economics onto investigating how these so-called scarce resources are then distributed and employed economically and efficiently. But what's going on behind that is you've got a whole series of relationships, which I call interplay, between the various abilities and powers of people to do something for each other. And that is what I want to focus on in this shift to an ontology of who-ness. I want to focus on, at least first of all, in the realm of economics, but it goes further than economic interplay, that what we actually are doing in our economic lives is an interplay in which we are evaluating and estimating each other's powers and abilities in the sense of what we can do for each other. And then this is simply pushed to one side, and it's turned into some sorts of, mathematical equations. And you have the old Adam Smithian theory of labor value, which Marx adopted and didn't quite get rid of it in his in Das Kapital. But you also have in the realm of classical economics, you have the theory of marginal productivity, marginal utility. Marginal utility is supposed to be that factor which determines where supply and demand come into equilibrium with one another, and so on. But they overlook that it's not a quantity of labor that is exchanged for another equal quantity of labor, as Adam Smith would have it, or one side of Marx would have it, as in adopting this labor theory of value, and what Marxism has adopted. And it's a theory on very shaky footing. But it's not the quantity of labor, it's how these various labors of different kinds come into a relationship of mutually estimating each other. And there are real people behind that, and also the earth. So that's what I want to do, to shift the focus onto this. This is what is lying behind what's going on in capitalism. And that's why I call it the gainful game, which is, and I use this term advisedly because it is a game. It's in the sense of an interplay, and it is also out for gain. And to be able to see that, you have to see that it's not just a matter of exchanging commodities, but you have capital, which is a form of money, but it's money in action. It's money that sets things into movement, a productive movement to produce things. And they could be goods or they could be services. But these goods and services are then, they are organized by the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is the figure. Marx would say, it's the capitalist, what Marxists would call the capitalist, who brings the factors of production together, and they are the labor power of the laborers, the earth itself as a location to actually do something, or it provides the raw materials, it's mined, or you need it, to do any sort of farming. You need the earth to plant the crop in and have it grow, and you also need the means of production, which could be a factory, it could be a harvester, anything you like. But behind these means of production, there are also people who have produced these means of production. So the basic elements are, you've got an acknowledgement, you've got an exploitation by the entrepreneur of these basic factors of production, namely people's powers and abilities, and on the other hand, the powers provided naturally by nature.
I think, Michael, I've got like a brain explosion happening here. I'm thinking about the distinction between needs and wants. I'm thinking about that shoe analogy you used, an example, and how now what we're saying is society is dictating the way technology is going to be used. Just produce something and they'll work it out, and they can use it any which way they want. It doesn't have one function, it has lots of functions. I'm looking at this notion of us going away from the earth, the location, which has been so important in the past. We used to have if we looked at all our sectors in the world, agriculture was like very primary and important to us. I constantly say, you can't swallow chips for food, don't forget to invest in seeds. Whenever these venture capitalists are coming along and saying techno, everything, I say, don't forget, the earth is feeding us. But this movement away from that which locates us to this ethereal thing, which is somewhere in the cloud, whatever that is. But I'm also looking at the fact that we haven't even just said, these are the things we produced. We've become thingified. We are now part of the machine of that doing, beyond just the labor process. I think about even the way academic roles have changed, over the centuries. When you read back and, we look at the ancient times, it wasn't so much like the university, it was different, but there were learning institutions and where people gathered to learn. And today, now that we call them universities, what's changed in the last 100 years about education, it's almost like we are trying to say, you need to produce, this many number of papers in these kinds of journals with this kind of A-star quality ranking. And if you don't, you're not really cutting it in the mold. And it's frustrating for many people who are in academia for the teaching part, the imparting of knowledge, and also the gaining of knowledge. It's two-way, it's not one way. But thingifying academia, I think, is a great example of how we're going away from the parchment where we used to write things and hold books to this other thing, which is about grants, is about getting money. It's about writing a number of papers. And if you don't make it into these 6 or 8 basket journals in maybe business or in IT, then, you know, you haven't really made it. I wonder if you could connect more of what you're saying to these kinds of things that we're seeing, the thingification of almost everything, ourselves even.
Yeah. Well, one aspect of that is that the universities have become institutions that first and foremost are there, and increasingly so, to produce trained people who will fit into the economy. So you have already, and it's become stronger over the past decades, that when students choose their courses, they choose them according to what are the job prospects. So that if they get a job which has a job opportunity, if they choose a course that has a job opportunity, then they are able to slip into this ongoing capitalist movement. And it's the capitalist, this movement of capital, which has to be gainful in itself to be able to employ people. But it's also that the players who are made for this game are interested in gain in the form of income. And income is another form of value. I mean, it's monetary, but it's also something that comes from doing something for a company, say. It could be for a bureaucracy in the state, but let's just keep it with the basic capitalist economy. And so everybody has to be interested in earning income. And this is something where this classical distinction between needs and wants kind of drifts apart. You can say that there are certain basic needs we have. We need to eat, we need shelter. These are needs, but if you look at it more closely, then you see that what we eat and how we are sheltered, this is entirely dependent upon the way of living at a certain time, and that even these needs are limitless. They switch over into wants.
Yes.
So you may be able to have shelter, but then you want to have a better house or a house with more rooms. So that the needs are also connected with a desire to have more. So we're all infected by this desire to have more, and are very pleased when we do have more income to finance a better standard of living. So the whole distinction between needs and wants becomes very muddy. And I would say that each of the players, not just the capitalists, not just the entrepreneurs, not just the bankers, not just the landowners leasing out their land, but everyone has a kind of or is seduced by this prospect of having more. And if they don't have enough, then you have this other level of, there are plenty of people who are striving to get onto the first rung of having a standard of living which is acceptable in any sort of crude terms. So you do have a a global problem of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm saying that the driving force when you're in the game, the gainful game, and earning various sorts of income, when a most basic one is your wages, your salary.
Mm.
But if you have some savings, then you are interested in the gain it will have from investing it, and you get interest, or you will invest it in the stock market by shares in an operating company, and then you're interested in the dividends that this company pays. So we're all in it more or less.
Yes.
Some are in a very poor position. They hardly get their foot on the first rung, and others, we're on the first rung, the second rung, the third rung, and going up to the famous 1% who have everything. They have more than enough. But it can still be characterized as the gainful game, and it is inherent in this gainful game that it has no inherent limit within itself. There is always room to have more, to improve our standard of living, to improve well-being. And capitalist societies, or the liberal capitalist societies, pride themselves, or perhaps in certain phases when everything is going well, they pride themselves on having provided their populations with a very comfortable standard of living. Or else you find the rhetoric of how much capitalist development has brought millions and hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And on the one hand, you could say this is not true. On the other hand, you can actually point to that there have been improvements in the way in which large numbers of people in various parts of the world have been able to get into this gainful game and have actually improved their material standards of living. That's what's going on in, say, Southeast Asia. It's going on in India. You can look at South Korea, very, very poor countries, or even you look at Japan, which came out of the Second World War in a terrible state, but it learnt how to play this capitalist game of the gainful game extremely successfully.
Yes.
And so it calls for reflection on what is this game we're playing, and why do we play it, and is that the be all and end all? To accumulate things of value, to be captive to this thingified value, and not consider that what is actually going on is that we are evaluating each other's powers and abilities in terms of what we can do for each other. And we see this with this scandalous state of affairs we have these days in, well, at least in the developed West. I don't know how it is in other parts of the world, but in there is a standard discourse these days about care, about caring for the population, and the West has a demographic problem because the affluent societies tend to have fewer children, and you have this bubble coming up of, it's already here, of a lot of old people who are no longer in a position to care for themselves. You need carers. You need people who take care. And if you look at this sector of the economy, if it's just regarded as a sector of the economy, these carers are treated extremely badly. Their contribution, their powers and abilities in providing care for others is estimated via this thingified value very meagerly. So first of all, you have poor conditions in care homes, old age care homes. You have bad conditions of work for the people, and you have a kind of stinginess, which is reflected in the government, but it's also the way the economy works is that these people come out on the bottom. How come? There's something going wrong there, that these powers and abilities that these people have are not worth as much in monetary terms. How come?
Yeah, teachers, midwives, the same thing. Carers, a lot of students from international remote locations who come to the West to study usually have these roles, but it is appalling, and it comes back to this notion of operational effectiveness. And I remember looking at one case study of a local aged care facility that wanted to go robots, allegedly to allow the workers to have, the carers to have more time with the actual aged in the facility, so the robots would be taking the linen across the corridor, so the carers didn't, and the nurses didn't have to walk so far, whatever. But it's like, we're now creating things to even deal with that care problem. Just the robots will do it. There's not enough of us to go around, Michael. The aging population, look at Japan, zero birth rate. They'll have to figure it out. And the craziness is, the people that are engaged in the process of thingifying are the ones that are going to find themselves needing care. So they're building the robots that would take care of them. It's a little bit of a cycle there.
Yeah, it's quite crazy. There's quite a lot of craziness to this, and if you consider the introduction of robots, they are only introduced when they are cost efficient. So there's always an argument in the background going on there about what is more cost efficient. Is a real human carer more expensive to hire than a robot which can do many of the same tasks? So if this is the case, then of course the cost efficiency argument says, well, we will use robots. But then you mentioned Japan, and Japan is not alone in this, but it's probably the most extreme example, is that instead of encouraging and making the caring profession more attractive by, for a start, providing better wages and better working conditions, and better working conditions always cost more. You have in Japan a xenophobia. There's a very insular culture. And so at all costs, they want to keep foreigners out. They have an extremely low proportion of foreigners living in the country. But you have that also in the affluent Western countries, this xenophobia, which is a main portion of the nationalism that is now rampant throughout the world, of regarding those who want to come to a country as somehow enemies, as useless people, as people who are just coming to bludge of us, who are just going to use the social welfare system and whatever. You have these political arguments raging on and on, all directed towards the stranger, the other, the foreigner, and this is all stoked by a fear of the other. So there's an awful lot of anxiety here, fear and anxiety, instead of a preparedness to acknowledge that others, even foreigners, have something to offer. And there are many who are really prepared to offer something in a new country. And this is also an aspect of this thingification, that whether foreigners are let into the country is put into a certain sort of calculus of, can we use them, that is a national economy, can we use them in the economy that we have going, in the jobs that we are offering, and put them profitably to work for some company or other. So it's all kind of filtered. It's because the thingification is always blurring and obstructing the view of what is really going on, is that we are not estimating each other's powers and abilities in an appropriate way. And this is what I call, well, not just I call, this is fairness. When things are fair, this again comes from Aristotle. It comes from Aristotle when he talks about commutative justice. And he says that when you exchange one thing for another, it has to be fair if it is to be just. And you can't really tie it down. You can't really tie down what, define fairness or determine it quantitatively. But a main criterion for judging fairness is that the players involved in the interplay are satisfied with the deal, with the exchange. And what we have, say, with the immigration policy of a certain country, it could be Australia, Japan, it could be Great Britain, the US, that they treat these foreigners, or what they need for their workforce, simply as these, basically as things, as what's that are useful for the economy as it's now running, or maybe running in the future.
Yes.
So there's always this thingification is always tied to a confusion between who and what.
You remind
and
me,
it's
Michael.
very convenient. It's very convenient to treat people as what's, and they are statistics, and they are factors of production. I mean, you have this scandalous term which is used just all the time: human capital.
Yes.
And it's one of the most perverse terms that was ever invented. You take capital, which is the name for a thingified value in movement, and you say humans are this thingified capital because they can be put into motion just like capital to throw off a profit. But this inversion that goes on. What is really important are the human capabilities and what we can do for each other, and it's inverted into, well, how much profit will you bring if we put you to work?
It very much reminds me of things I've seen as I've traveled through Asia with work when I was working in industry. It's not just the thingification of the person. For example, the cheap maids in Singapore who would quietly protest every now and then in the city, and you would know because they all looked similar. But it's almost the objectification of these workers. They're not just workers in the house. Some of them end up being sex slaves. And in some other way, that notion of slavery as well, like there's a fine line between human capital and slavery and the objectification of the individual or the woman. It's traditionally a woman who's a maid at many of these locations. But again, it's the affluent having the power to actually make this exchange. And as my youngest boy was learning chess, we talk about games today, Michael Eldred. Often when he was learning, we would tell him about the pieces, the pawn and the queen and so forth. And we would say, what do you think? And he'd say, no, I don't think this is a fair exchange. So if a child understands what a fair exchange is, it's very interesting to me that we allow these things to happen in the manipulation of the workforce as human capital. The other thing I've seen is almost this entire global enslavement. But it's like this wave that starts in the West and then goes whoosh into the developing nations. And what we're seeing today is this movement. We've saturated, what was traditionally known as the developed nations. And now we've even saturated building our factories and supply chains centered in these cheap labor forces. Again, another disgusting term, cheap labor force. And they happen to be in places where the wages are much less, significantly less, and the operational expenses are less. And what we're seeing is, well, once we've gone through this 3G or 4G or 5G upgrade in the West, we're going to go through it in the newly industrialized countries as they were once termed, not anymore, and then the developing nations. Even then, we've become so heinous in saying, let's create a different mindset. Let's fly in and offer everyone a laptop because the laptop, the seductive thing, is going to help bring them out of poverty. Not that it won't assist, but it's like this big wave and it keeps coming. Waves come in sets. That's exactly what we're seeing. And if people stand back to look at this, first we're going to roll out this, then we're going to roll out that, and then the next thing, and then what? When are we going to feed people, Michael?
Yeah, but it's a very ambiguous state of affairs, because on the one hand, it is, as you say, that from the perspective of developing nations and from the perspective of the capitals, the capitalists using capital in these developing nations, they themselves are interested in producing, having a supply chain which is, say, rooted in Bangladesh, for textiles, what have you.
Yes.
And so the cost efficiency argument of this is a cheap labor force, and so the workers in the Czech Republic are put out of work, or where you have other or you even had in Germany, you had a really flourishing textile industry. You had it in Britain, of course, in the 19th century. The textile industry was one of its main industries. You talk about Manchester. Mm-hmm. Manchester was a synonym for anything to do with bed linen and things made from cotton. But that's long gone. Why? Because the cost efficiencies have shifted. And so it becomes profitable, not just profitable, but also under the competitive pressure. The competitive pressure that you have to look around if you're a textile maker, you're a clothing manufacturer or a shoe manufacturer, you are forced under the cost pressure to look around for those cheap labor sources. And what we are witnessing today is that on the other side, that very slowly and pointedly, there is an increased awareness among consumers that there are people behind these shoes, there are people behind these T-shirts, and so you have the phenomenon of even consumers in the West becoming interested in where are these things being sourced. Yes. And is labor power being put to work in those countries under unacceptable conditions. I mean, this is what I would say would be an instance of seeing through the veil of the thing, of the thingly value. A cheap T-shirt costs you $5. and instead looking behind, well, who produced it and what did they get from it? So it's not exactly that there's an absolute blindness to it, but it needs to be encouraged that, say, textile workers in Bangladesh gain more, a higher estimation of their labor power than they have hitherto. But it's not just the consumers in the West that can do this, but also that within these countries themselves, of course, the workers themselves have to be in a position to resist and to point out how they are being exploited under very poor working conditions. So there's a struggle going on.
What do you think it's going to take, Michael? I mean, some companies are saying we're done. We're done with having operations in some places. We've realized that we can now stay within our own borders, wherever that is in the West, create a factory that doesn't have people, doesn't have human capital, will displace the people out of the process because our technologies and our things are becoming highly complex. They're no longer like the shoe and the cushion and the linen cover. We're now going towards the manufacture of more seductive technologies we can buy. And, you know, there's an endless consumption to those, though they have huge externalities for the environment. We're seeing workers, children workers, right, in parts of Africa who are going and trying to find these kinds of components for our mobile phones. And they're in deep mines for 8-hour stints in terrible conditions. So with the paradox is, with the increase in the complexity of the technology, we still need the minerals, we still need the resources to actually make the things. We still need that terrible enslavement of young children, which should never happen anywhere, even for cocoa and the making of Mars bars, right? Because that's what was happening in sort of South America. But we still have this terrible abuse, right? This physical, indirect abuse of young workers who shouldn't be workers at all. They should be children, because we're still looking to make these things. So I'm wondering, if we go back to this value chain and this interplay, and the fact that the players know their game really well, can anyone really say, I can't be corporate, I'm being corporate, corporate responsibility, I'm following these compliance rules, look, I'm saying no poverty, I'm starting shop in developing nations to give people work. Where is this going if the players know exactly what they're doing and we're sort of not unraveling what's going on, source to production, the finished product? Are we just going to keep playing this game until when?
Yeah, but there is this very ruthless side, and that's not going to go away of itself. But on the one hand, you can only say that in these parts of the world, let's say Africa, India, Bangladesh, where there are very poor working conditions, you can see maybe a counter movement in African entrepreneurs developing companies that are more attuned with the African social environment and actually want to do something put capital to work in an appropriate way to adequately acknowledge the abilities of the Africans who are working there. And on the other hand, you have in the West, we have it's not inconsiderable under the banner of ESG, these environmental, social, and governance, that this has also become a factor in the way normal people in normal affluent people say, like anybody with a kind of reasonable job in the West would have some kind of superannuation. What's it called in the US? A 401k or whatever. There is also an awareness growing, and it's also become practical in that investors are now saying we will invest in companies whose activities we know and whose activities we also evaluate for how they work. And we will boycott those companies that ride roughshod over people in these developing countries. So that's not to be sneezed at. If I compare that, like looking back over the past, say, 20 years, around 2000, this ESG aspect was minuscule. Today, it's a little bit more. But it's one step in this seeing through the veil of what's going behind this veil of thingification, where things are simply mysterious. Well, one other thing I wanted to point to was that the science of economics itself, because of its focus on resources, employing resources, and they have to be distributed because they're scarce and so on and so forth. And they also have to be put to work profitably. And with regard to the environmental crisis we're in, especially with regard to climate change, you'll find arguments. But it's a standard and pretty much accepted argument that economic growth cannot go on forever because the resources of the planet are finite and we have been exploiting them to the hilt for so long that we are now in deep, deep trouble. And what worries me about this is that in claiming that, they have adopted a concept of economic growth that is completely in line with the orthodox theory of economics. But if you see through the thingification of this, is all in terms of value, and value is then equated with physical stuff. That increasing value, augmenting value as capital is equated with increased, more rapid, more intense exploitation of the Earth's resources. But if you view that as this is capital grows through value augmentation. That is not synonymous. It's not the same thing as exploiting the Earth more. It's not the same thing. And in fact, economic growth, if you regard it as estimating and valuing what we can do for each other, in that sense, there are no limits at all to growth. In fact, there is plenty of room for growth in fairly evaluating each other's abilities. So I think the ecological movement has swallowed a false argument, or has not seen through the thingification itself, in saying that we have to stop, and we have to lower our standard of living, and these kinds of things, without seeing that there is plenty of room for economic growth in terms of valuing, evaluating, estimating each other without necessarily intensifying our exploitation of the earth.
I'm constantly seeing hockey stick growth for lots of things. Students. That's one thing we see at universities, anywhere in the world, anywhere you're employed. It's always about getting more students, because that actually equates to more money and means you can do more things with that money. You can hire more people. And so it's this revolving thing. That's why, Michael, I'm finding a lot of universities and a lot of boards don't like Aristotle and Plato. I know they might shock you, but they really think, that was like the worst thing that could have happened to society. And I'm taken aback very often, because it's this belief that it's the entrepreneurial model that we're distributing and teaching, and it is offensive, but I always look, and my brother's an accountant, so whenever I see the hockey stick growth, I'm just thinking the bubble's got to burst somewhere. And so when is it going to burst? Is that what we're seeing about to happen? Because this growth, first of all, your human workers cannot keep up with this kind of growth when everything else is equal and you're not hiring more people like during a pandemic. And so you can say, I want more students, but you've still got the same people that are already stretched at capacity doing this work. And so something fails, quality fails. But I am concerned about the pressure that this hockey stick growth is placing on our resources, on our natural resources and minerals, and water, in particular water and air quality. Those are the two things I'm mostly concerned about. Clean water, because water doesn't come about just like, when it takes a long time to create water into the water cycle. People would be shocked at how many thousands of years for a drop of water, and so we've got these artesian wells, we're just sitting there, pumping them out, going, it'll be right, don't worry about it, we've got water for now. Particularly in desert locations where we've decided to set up shop and keep shipping bottles and bottles of plastic with water, wherever that water is coming from. But I do think about the global south, and they don't have this hockey stick growth. They don't think about the world like that. They've got other value systems. And what we haven't done well in the West is to learn from the other value systems that exist around the world. How human generosity works in villages in Kenya, how people care for one another, for example, in Mexico, and not care. It depends on what spectrum you're looking at and what context. But I think this emphasis on the value you're speaking about today, the thingification, can you reverse that? Can we say, look, the value is me, the human Katina and the human Michael, and our interplay is the value. That's the joy. That's what it's about, being alive, right? How do we get that mentality into other entities? Let's call them corporations that are currently very complex, and some of them are into very interesting layered, meshed value chains. One day they're a mobile phone operator, the next they're the biggest health insurer in the world. But how does the average person know that? How do we shift this back to humans? Like, what's the process that we need to undertake there? How does that happen? And how long does it take?
Well, I can't make any predictions. So all I can say is what we need is a change of mind, and a change of mind requires another way of thinking. And the other way of thinking has to go back, as you say, we have to go back to the drawing board and think about what you mentioned there: hockey stick growth, exponential growth, and this is seen as a good thing from a capitalist economic perspective. We have growth, hockey stick growth, exponential growth. But how is it measured? It's measured basically in monetary terms. Monetary. But what's behind the money? What's this money valuing? we have to look more particularly about the if growth is not measured in terms of monetary value, it has to be differentiated according to how well people are living within the gainful game and having, as we say in Australia, a fair go.
Yes.
There is fair play, and this changes the character of the economic growth altogether. When a fairer society, a society in which the contribution that people have to make is estimated also in income terms in a more appropriate way. And there's another thing, picking up your point about Plato and Aristotle, when you quote some colleague or whatever of yours is saying that Plato and Aristotle were a disaster. In fact, it was Plato and Aristotle that put us on this path. If you look at the beginning, Plato and Aristotle are the foundations. They're the foundations of Western philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And this Western philosophy has at its core this ontology of movement that is productive movement. And you'll find it in Plato.
Yes.
And you'll find it in Aristotle. And you'll find it in Aristotle in a much more sophisticated form, because he actually developed the ontology of productive movement. That was the foundation many centuries later for Newton developing his physics. Mathematical physics has three very simple laws of motion, but he uses the same terms as Aristotle invented or used and also invented in his ontology of productive movement. And one of the ironies of it is that we are all interested, everybody has to be interested in something we call energy, energy generation. Nobody, not in most parts of the world, if you don't have an energy supply, and that basically is electricity, you have to generate electricity in some way or another to live in any sort of comfortable way. And I don't mean you have to have internet access for that. You need electrical energy, but even without internet access, you still need energy. And even if it's you have some torches with battery operated torches, and you have whatever. You look at this word energy, and you find, where did it come from? It's not just a word. It's not just a linguistic fancy, but it's a word that was coined by Aristotle himself for his ontology of movement, of productive movement, because there you have a force which is put to work. And this putting to work is in Greek, it's putting into energeia. Because the word energeia in Greek means literally in workness. So energy is in workness of a force. And without this ontology of movement, which was just tacitly adopted by the modern mathematized sciences, just starting with Newton, but going on to every other science, we wouldn't have any modern science. Just wouldn't have been there, because this ontology would have been lacking. So what they did was they dropped the ontological insight, that it was a problem of understanding philosophical what is movement at all. You just drop that. That's not interesting. It's trivial. Things move. We want to know how to control this movement. And for that, we need certain concepts: force, energy. And that becomes, and you'll find that throughout, from the beginnings of modern physics with Newton and Galileo, but going right through to quantum theory, you'll find they're talking about forces and why. I mean, it's simply modifications of the same template of the ontology of productive movement. So you can say, for better or for worse, we wouldn't be where we are in the West without Plato and Aristotle. So
fascinating. Tell me, Michael.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if you go back to Plato and Aristotle and read not just the ontology of productive movement, but other things, you'll come across completely different ideas, just as say Marx did by going back to the 5th chapter of the chapter in the Nicomachean Ethics on justice and discovering the germ of the value form which he developed, which was the foundation, the foundational core of what he then develops as capital, as a critique of what capitalism is. So the Greeks, and especially Plato and Aristotle, are a very rich resource, not just as tradition and they were great guys or they were bad guys, they were stupid white men or whatever, but because they offer so much for our thinking and for our own mindset by reassessing. It's not just adopting. I don't become a Platonist. I don't become an Aristotelian. I don't just adopt them. The only thing that's interesting in them is to reread them with a view to revising them, to seeing them anew, and to kind of fathoming the depth of insight that they themselves had, which we have totally lost. We have totally lost it. It's all become now, you just cap that, you cap this ontological depth. There's no need for it. We just don't need it. And there's a difference between simply taking things, beings, as factual things, which is what we do as a matter of course today. They're just, people are interested in the facts, and asking what is the being of a being. You say, well, it's not interesting. It's practically useless, right? But in that way, you've closed off access to the depths where these things can be seen very simply in such a way that they can also be revised, that is, seen anew and then cast anew, that we don't have to be tied forever in our history to the ontology of productive movement. There can be an alternative, but in order for there to be an alternative on this very simple elementary foundation, we have to recast this very simple elementary foundation by revising, say, what Plato, Aristotle, Anaxagoras, and the rest of them said when they were grappling with extremely simple elementary phenomena that are still with us today. I mean, no one's going to deny that there is still movement today. It's still a problem. No one's going to deny that there's something like time, but time is one of the greatest unsolved problems in philosophy to this very hour, that it's just simply been ignored. We've just become, we've said, okay, time, as Aristotle said, it's the number of movement. Like movement is the basic phenomenon. Time is simply counting it off.
Frequency.
So we have clocks. We have clocks. right? And our clocks are much better than the Greek clocks, right? They just had sundials, and they looked at the sun and the planets, and to look at time is when the sun comes around to the same position, that's one day, right? And when the moon comes around to the same position, that's 1 month, and so forth. But like, we got much better clocks. We've got cesium clocks, and we can break down this measuring of movement to the, to nanoseconds. We can measure nanoseconds. Aren't we great? But it's basically, it remains basically clock time. And even if you look at the relativity theory that introduced by Einstein, that was such a revolution in physics. The big revolution. People are still pondering it today and think, wow, what a genius. I mean, Einstein is the genius of the 20th century, and everyone says, wow. He still works with this very primitive conception of clock time. And the whole relativity theory would fall to pieces if he did not conceive the whole thing in terms of clocks being measured, clocks measuring time on the basis of the signals they receive, the electromagnetic signals they receive from some object or other. You wouldn't have it. So his whole ontology, and it's a very subjectivist ontology, because each of the observers, the scientists observe us, with their apparatuses. All they are doing is measuring signals received from somewhere. Now, the paradigm is cosmology. You are able to research the secrets of the universe because you are receiving electromagnetic waves, and they are registered by apparatuses, which are then converted into a form that scientists can read and understand. And on the basis of these received signals, you can say, yeah, Einstein was right. There is a relativity in time. It can be compressed, it can be dilated. Wow, what a mind! But it's not the solution. That's not the solution of the question regarding time, simply because it's derivative of movement. And I say just the opposite. I say that it is time that enables movement. But what is this time? What is the time that enables movement? We spoke about that in our last talk a little bit. Well, I just can only hint at it here. There is a three-dimensionality of our mind, a temporal three-dimensionality of our mind, which enables us to see movement as movement. And that's not receiving a signal from anywhere. This is this ability of our mind to see movement is given by our power of imagination. And this imagination is stretched into three different temporal dimensions. So we can imagine, because imagine in this wider sense of, we have a memory, we can orient ourselves towards what's here in the present, and we can also project, look into the future, not in the way of prediction, but also simply in the way of envisaging what is possible. Envisaging what is possible is far more important than being able to predict along linear time what's going to come. But our whole mindset these days is only interested in what's coming. Can we predict it? And all of our science is tied to this quest, and it is not regarded as a science at all if it can't do that. It's a lousy science. A non-predictive science is simply, well, it's useless. It's why? Because it doesn't allow us to master movement.
Mm-hmm. It's
I
interesting
mean,
what
that
you're
also
saying there.
applies. Yeah, and it also this applies particularly to also to the capitalist economy,
Mm-hmm.
because the capitalist economy too runs according to clock time, because it's not interested in the time, it's in the movement. It's
Mm-hmm.
interested in the movement of capital, which is reified or thingified value in movement, getting fatter. It has to, if it doesn't get fatter, it disappears. It's a failure. It has to have a success. It has to have success in throwing off profit, that is
Yes.
augmenting. And the faster it turns over, if you can get capital to turn over faster and faster, each time it throws off profit, you increase the profit. So why do we have this mad hectic race today? Keeping up with things, and I've got to do this and I've got to do that, and the boss has given me that to do, and I've got, why? Underlying it, even though it's quite, it's a mystery, it
Mm-hmm.
is all tied back to the movement of the total global capital in a augmentative movement of value. And this is what dictates the pace of life.
Mm-hmm.
It is dictating our own life movements, because we've got to keep up
It's
with
an
the movement of
endless loop.
capital.
It's an endless loop.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
as you
Oh,
say,
yeah.
as you say, Michael. It's if it's not in a spreadsheet, if it's not being timed. Look at our workers. They're timed, and I don't mean to pick on McDonald's here as a food chain, but they're timed to perfection. Everything is timed.
Mm.
We are wearing these devices you're talking about. It's no longer the relativity theory that says, I'm looking at light bouncing off and coming back in electromagnetic signals. We're wearing the signals. It's measuring our heart rate and our pulse rate and our stress levels and our temperature levels and all our vital signs and characteristics, to the
Mm.
point now that we're going below, we're decorporalizing the body and saying we're going to chop up the person into signals, into movements, just to measure, are they going the right way between step A and B, between C and D, or no, they should hurry up, or else we're going to put them on contract and we'll kick them out of the company, because that is the mentality. I remember one student telling me she was working for an international company at one stage, and that they were timing the calls. I mean, this happens in call centers around the
Mm.
world.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
if you've
yeah.
if you've ever observed a call center in action, the boss is usually smoking about 40 cigarettes a day. It's
Mm.
horrendous, and their stress levels are huge, because they've got throughput to reach. They've got the number of calls to get through. They've got to be on the phone for the average, time the busy hour is. It's all movement and time based. And if you don't cut it, well, then you're spat out. That's got
Yeah.
to change. That's got to change.
Yeah. And first of all, we have to see it very clearly, and say this has to change. Or another example related with the call centers, with the with the outsourcing of our understanding of the world into algorithms,
Mm-hmm.
and the algorithms are then put to work in the cyber world, put to work to automatically control some sort of movement or other, and it could be the movement in a call center. So you have algorithms that when you ring up and want to talk to a human being, you never, only with some difficulty, and often only if you're very lucky, do you ever come into the pleasure of talking with a real human being, because first of all, you've got the algorithms in the way, and the algorithms are supposed to improve the cost efficiency by replacing expensive human people by kind of intercepting the calls and kind of trying to deal with it algorithmically, automatedly, very cheaply, and seeing whether they can get rid of this caller on the cheap. And only if the algorithms that you've you've so far encountered cannot solve the problem, you put through to a real live human being, and it's all dictated by the cost efficiency strategies and the competitive pressure to keep costs down.
You know, Michael, a lot of people don't realize that when you call into a call center, I mean, I used to work for a telecommunications company. They invented the PABX at the time, and you call into a call center, right? And the reason why you go through this, number of waving, press 0 if you want to speak to a human. That's what we used to hear, right? But now you hear, just go to the website. That's the message. Go to the website. It's not even dial this, dial that. Just go to the website. We'll help you there. You'll talk to a chatbot there. Everything will be all right. Just start to learn to interact. And now there are studies that have been done that say people are much happier not to talk to other people, which I find alarming, because they're used to interacting, in text to a chatbot. But the real issue is that not adequate training was done for cheap labor, right? In developing nations, the big companies didn't think they had to train these workers properly. And so people stopped calling through call centers because, first of all, they couldn't understand who they were speaking to. And this is not a racial thing. It was just a truism, right? Or there was a delay in the signal, and so you couldn't hear the other person at all. So it was like, give up straight away. I'm not going to get anything done here unless I spend 5 hours on the phone. But the other thing is, you're put on these waving press 1, press 5, press 7, this nestedness, because what that gives the call center is an extra 30 seconds that they're saving in operational costs. It means one less worker. So the point is not to wave you to the right person. The point is to keep you on these dials, either to the point you give up and get off. You'll go face to face, or you'll forget about the problem. The extra charge that shouldn't have been there, it's not worth my time because I've already been online for 3 hours and I just wanted to clear a $60 fee off my phone bill. But forget about it. I'm just going to walk away because my 3 hours is worth more than $60. And these companies know that. And so you'll see these errors, which sometimes I think are calculated. They're deliberate because people just don't have time. They're not looking at their documentation anymore. They're receiving them over email, and we get too much email, so it gets buried. But it's about nestedness. It's not about operational efficiency. The company wants to save money, will put less workers on. Or if you're Google or Facebook, we just won't have any human interaction with any worker because there is no one to call. You try and get through to a Facebook salesperson, you can't. And that's the paradox. These high-tech companies which are encouraging connectivity, but no, you can't talk to people. Not to us anyway. You can talk to each other, but not to us who offer you this complex service. So the gamers in their gaming, whoa, they're really smart, Michael, because this, soon, who knows, maybe we will be talking to Google bots and we'll think they're Google employees. You had this notion of the Turing Test. Maybe you wanted to tell us about where we're going with that. What happens when we don't know whether someone is a bot or a human?
Yeah. Maybe what you refer to, apart of Turing, yeah, I'll say something about Turing, but what this drive for cost efficiency is, with the example of the call center, but you can find, I mean, there are just countless examples. There's no end to it, that the reasons why the algorithms are put in place is always because it improves the cost efficiency. And this is an example of the inversion that goes on, where people's abilities are only seen through the thingified value. So the thingified value gains the upper hand and dictates whether a living person is going to be employed for that service or not. And because the algorithms, once they are written, can be used again and again and again and again, it doesn't cost anything extra, they turn out to be extremely cheap in the long run. And once you get a good or even a bad programmer to write them, then they more or less without cost. So, and even those who are deploying them, the companies that are deploying them, they themselves are the dupes and the chumps of the movement of capital, because they are forced to, in the competitive struggle with other companies, to lower the costs.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps when you refer to a manager who's smoking 40 cigarettes a day and is near to a heart infarct.
Yes.
This guy too is a chump. I mean, he's one of the people just inserted into the operation, and the operation itself, viewed very simply, is the movement of capital turning over and producing profit, the value augmenting. And so the value augments all the better, the less you pay for the labor power. So what do? You use the algorithms to get rid of the labor power because it's too expensive, or it's relatively more expensive. And as soon as something becomes relatively more expensive, it may still be very cheap, but as soon as it becomes more expensive than an algorithm, then it's done away with.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an increasing problem with the cyber world, that the algorithms we can never get through. We can never get through to a real human being. And if you have a problem, and you have continual problems with algorithms because they don't meet the situation, there's either, there could be simply an error in the algorithm, or the algorithm cannot cope with a certain situation. It simply cannot cope, and there will never be algorithms that can cope with every situation in an interaction with humans. So when the algorithms fail, you need to talk to somebody, and it becomes a real struggle. But on the Turing business, Turing in one way, I don't put a spotlight so much on this Turing test, which was a later paper of his, I think about 1950 or 51.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But the paper which really knocked me out, and it's the reason why there is the Turing Prize, which is the Nobel Prize of computing. The reason that there is such a thing is because of his 1936 paper, which he wrote at the age of 24, would you believe? 24, where he invented the universal Turing machine, not under that name, which is still the foundation of all computer science. If you do foundational work in computer science, you have to go back to this, because it accounts for everything that a computer can do on this very simple elementary level. Anything a supercomputer can do, a Turing machine or a series of Turing machines can do. So they're equivalent problems. But the really disturbing thing about Turing is that he conceives this invention of the Turing machine as basically what we humans do when we think. So even he starts speaking in the 40s. He starts speaking in the 40s of the electronic brain.
Yeah.
So he's in the same orbit, scientific orbit of reducing the mind to the brain, and if you have a Turing machine or a series of Turing machines, then you can model this thing called the brain, which in it is a thing. It's a bodily thing, and we need it. If you can do that, then you can sensibly talk of the electronic brain, and that is isomorphic. It's the same. It's equivalent. It's equivalent to the human mind. So we get into this whole problematic of when the electronic brain is going to become smarter than a human. And it's just accepted as, it's going to happen one day, and it's just a matter of how many computations you can do, how many computations a supercomputer can do compared to a human brain, because the human brain is only regarded as a complex firing of neurons that are doing calculations. That's our mind.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no mind anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You can forget talking about the mind. It's a metaphysical construct,
Yes.
Inherited from the Greeks, but we don't need it. We're much better. We can actually build it. And we will build it one day. This supreme hubris and confidence of modern science is that one day we'll get there. It may take another 50 years, but we'll get there. And so all this dystopian vision of the computers taking over the world. But in any case, with the deployment of algorithms, you have this vision of automation in every single sphere of life, of every single sphere of, say, of economic life, so that the algorithms inserted in the various machines and devices, they simply displace human workers on cost efficiency grounds, and so it's envisaged. Well, the algorithms are going to do everything for us. It's all going to be automated. The people are just going to be out of a job. So what do? Universal basic income. I mean, this is a real cop-out. This is a real cop-out because it's seeing the problem through the lens of the thingification.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem lies really in seeing it as thingification and not seeing that we human beings have endless possibilities of doing something for each other, and that will never be done away with. Well, at least not by algorithms, or not by algorithms inserted into machines. And this confusion, confusing who and what, confuses also the critical discussion. The critical discussion, because it's swallowed by the critical discussion itself, because the mindset is infected. It accepts this inverted view of the world some way, or is caught up in it, instead of saying, okay, let's stop there and go back to very elementary things like I have a shoe and I want a bag of wheat for it, and what's involved in that.
There are students.
Or I'm involved. I'm involved in a conversation with you, Katina, and I don't know what you're going to say next. And no algorithm in the world will ever be able to give me advance notice of what you're going to say and what thoughts will come into your mind, not to your brain, what thoughts will occur to you in response to what I say. It's an interplay between us in which we are also exercising our abilities to actually understand, think, go along with, respond to. These are our abilities, and they're in an interplay, and you will never be able to adopt a standpoint, say an algorithmic standpoint, above us, between us, which will then conduct our interplay. And no, Katina is now going to say that, and I'm going to say that, and
Spontaneity, right? Imagine life without that.
Yeah.
Imagine life
freedom.
without
It's
that.
freedom. It's freedom.
Yeah.
We are each of us is the source of our own life movements, And that includes what we're going to say, what we are to think, and where our mind will wander next. It's spontaneous. Well, I know that something spontaneously occurs to me, and I'll say something, and something occurs to you spontaneously, which prompts you to say something in response to understanding something that I've said. But no one's in control.
That's right. We have a dear friend, Jeff Robbins, in the States at Rutgers University. He has a physics background as well, Michael, and he's written about one of his books that are coming out, I hope, very soon. He's written about what's happening to us as we choose the escalator over the stairs. Why is it that people will take the easy route? And of course, there's reasons why. It could be ill health, it could be age, but we're being conditioned by the machines to not use stairs, unless it's inconvenient for us to do that. But what is that doing to us? If we're not using our abilities, if we're not being spontaneous and meeting live and corresponding live and thinking and listening to each other, then what are we? Like this hunk of mass of what? Nothingness almost. We become nothing. We are something. We're invaluable, I feel, and we're connected together. But if we just reduce ourselves to a brain, this matter, then I don't know. It's very, apart from reductionistic, it's dehumanizing. And I wanted you to say something about the value of ethics here as a special movement. Tell me how then ethics comes into this.
Yeah, ethics. I propose something quite scandalous, I think, or blasphemous or whatever. That I have come through considering this alternative ontology of interplay as an interplay of powers. It can be an interplay of powers in with one another, can be against one another.
Mm-hmm.
It can be for one another. These are very rich kinds of movement that we are able to engage in this interplay, but it is a power play. And power plays can also be unfair, they can be ugly. So that's on the one side. You have this, the core of what I call social ontology resides precisely in the phenomenon, the rich phenomenon of interplay. And then we have, in the tradition, we have a philosophical core that was, with Aristotle, say, the metaphysics. Metaphysics consists of ontology and theology. And then you have the book of the physics. And then you have the very famous ethics. And the ethics that Aristotle develops, and also Plato has in his Politeia and so on, was never grounded in an ontology. And that has persisted right up to the present day, in that ethics kind of comes after the event and looks at what's going on in terms of movement in the world and says what is going on. And then it comes along and says, well, should that be the case? What ought to be the case? So there's always a disjuncture between what is and what ought to be. And that's still a standard distinction made in mainstream philosophy between is and ought. So the ought is somehow it's after the event, it's put on top and is supposed to bring what is under control from an ethical side of what ought to be. And my consideration is that this is only because ethics itself lacks its own ontology of movement, which is a social movement I call interplay. And this concept of interplay as a power play is able then to give another focus to ethical considerations. Ethical considerations, starting with, you know, the right to life, liberty, the liberty to lead your life as you want to. And so it's concerned with, ethics are concerned with liberty or freedom, with living, being able to live, and living itself is a movement. Freedom itself is a movement, but it is not a movement per se. Any freedom itself is an interplay with others. And it's a very naive conception of the so-called individualist idea of freedom, that I can do what I want. Freedom consists in my being able to do what I want when I want to, with a couple of provisos. But that is not freedom at all, because it's lacking the insight into the interplay that we are never individuals, or rather, we are individuals who are always associated. And the rise of the modern individual has everything to do with this thingified value, say money and income, which does give us a kind of individual freedom, because if I have the money, I can do with it what I want. And this gives the illusion of being free simply as an individual, because I have this thing which gives me the power. This money as reified value incorporates a power to do something, to exchange it for something else. But the real phenomenon of freedom has to be seen that it's not given by this fetishized thing called money. It's given by, ultimately, our interplay with others. We live with one another in a society. Everybody does. So our freedom can only consist in initiating our life movements in negotiation with others whom we have to also evaluate and estimate and regard, and not ride roughshod over them. Although that is one possibility for playing out this interplay, is that you just don't regard the other. You think they are just obstructions to what you want to do, which is just one extreme, one of the bad ends of the spectrum of how this interplay can be played out unfairly. But our freedom can only consist in our social interplay with one another on the most elementary level. And so I think the ethical considerations, say of freedom of movement, how to lead your life. I want to. It's no longer necessary for a woman to get married to gain a social position in the society. This is, she does not have to do that, simply because if you have an income, and this was one of the main points that Virginia Woolf made in that famous essay of hers, A Room of One's Own, if you have a room of your own, that, and by that she means also income, you also have a certain freedom attached to this thingified value. And that gives you a scope for shaping your own life through this medium of money, of having some property, or at least having an income. And so you see how these ethical considerations of in what freedom itself consists are tied to an ontology, a certain social ontology of movement.
Michael, I was going to ask you a bit earlier about empiricist philosophy.
What sort of philosophy? Sorry?
Empiricist.
Oh, empiricist. Oh, yeah. Okay.
And I want this sort of to be where we sort of, summate and finish this second part.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering if we just go back one and say how what you're proposing wasn't in Francis Bacon, wasn't in Locke, or it really didn't acknowledge movement in the same way. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I think it'd be very interesting. Some of the philosophers listening in will be very interested in this, because I'm sorry I didn't follow on that key question, which I think we should have addressed a little bit earlier, but I want to use it as a summation point here.
Okay, empiricism. I mean, that's one of the really big topics that needs to be discussed. The father of the empiricism, I'd say, is Francis Bacon. Long time ago, he proposes this empirical attitude towards the world. That is, you have experiences of the world, and knowledge consists in bringing these experiences together, and then by a process of induction, being able to bring these experiences under some sort of rule, so that you can gain a foothold in controlling the movement. And this is what, as a basis for science for Bacon, and also thereafter to the present day, is all about the control of some sort of movement encompassing all sorts of movement, change of any kind. And the basis for this is meant to reside in experiencing the world, gathering your facts and putting it into some sort of theoretical model that is then able to explain those facts so that you control it. And the litmus test is then that you have to experimentally test it. So it's experience going around on itself and testing itself experientially through experiment. So it's always the facts. There is nothing behind. There's nothing behind. And this is what I call the a posteriori understanding of empiricist science. And it's also, I think this is the main element of all mainstream philosophy, that it has an abhorrence of the ontological. And if you look up the standard, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you'll find they do have an entry for ontology. It's supposed to be the philosophy of what is. It's the philosophy of what is, what exists, what is, but it never asks this ontology in this mainstream philosophy doesn't ask, what does it mean to be? What does this be? What does this being entail? What is being itself? It simply doesn't ask this question. And there is no entry in this encyclopedia on the ontological difference. The difference between a being and its being as such, which is, again, sorry to mention him again, it's Aristotle. And this ontological difference has simply been swept away. It's been closed and says there is no such thing. It's nonsense. All we have are the facts, the experiential facts. They are a posteriori. They come after the fact of having experienced. Then you can gather the facts. You can use some sort of induction, or you can dream up some sort of theory. And this theory then has to be tested experiment, and in this way become, slowly to the truth or whatever, or better version of the truth. And then you have Popperian epistemology, which is verificationists or falsificationists. A scientific theory is true as long as this model, and it's only a model, has not been falsified. So it's lacking a foundation because all the theories are only models that has no ontological foundation, and the ontological foundation can only be given a priori, that is, before experience. And I use these two terms, a priori, a posteriori, adopting them from Kant. And Kant's critique of pure reason is out to show that there are synthetic judgments a priori. In other words, there are things we know prior to any experience of the world. And what does Kant say? This a priori knowledge consists in, now before any experience, before you get to the world at all, you already have a concept of object, something standing over against you as a subject. So he's already got this schema going of a subject endowed with consciousness, vis-a-vis something standing over against this subject, which is what he says is a Gegenstand. In English, object, an object. And he says the most remarkable thing, he says the conditions of possibility, of experience of the world are the same as the conditions of experience of objects in the world. So he's saying we can only experience the world if the things out there in the world are given to us as objects. And this objectivity of the object is constructed before, a priori, before any experience of the world. So in a way, we're stuck with it because of the ontology. And it's not simply it's not a model. It's not a theoretical model that could be falsified by any experiment at all, because it's not experiential. It's not experiential. So to falsify it, means to put it into question, and to put into question the way in which Kant envisages and casts the being of beings as objects. He casts the being of beings as objects in their objectivity. And this is accepted throughout science, and it's accepted also throughout mainstream philosophy. You will not find, maybe a handful of philosophers living on the world, in the world today, who will actually not talk about the world in terms of subject and object, that we are subjects, humans subjects, vis-a-vis the objective world, in some variant. But they will not give up this idea that the human is a subject.
That's what we're taught.
Unless at most they will say the subject is in danger.
Or it might be harmed. It might be harmed. There's a risk.
There may be the disappearance, if you take Foucault, the disappearance of the subject because the objects are taking over. Okay, you have this nightmare version, but it makes no difference whatever to the ontology. the ontology of subject and object. And this is, as I say, it's a priori. It's before an experience of the world, and to dislodge it or to put it into question requires thinking through these elementary things of what constitutes an object as an object, according to Kant. And then, what's he doing there? Does it hold water? You have to test it. Is this already a construct which he sets up? He adopted it from Descartes to say the subject is basically an encapsulated consciousness inside a body vis-a-vis the external world, which is a world of objects. So he's adopted that. So we have to consider, is this really the way things are? Is this really the way phenomena show themselves to be? Do we have an inside and outside in that sense? And empiricism doesn't want to know anything about it. Doesn't want to know about this problem, about this problematic. It doesn't want to go there. It doesn't want to go there.
Yeah.
And what we have from the mid-19th century is now Comte. What does Comte do? He's the father of positivism. He's the father of a science called sociology. So you have positivism, and I characterize positivism as the sealing off of the ontological difference, to say there are no questions there. There's nothing to be done. And sociology, if you listen to the media, where the media will turn to intellectual people, studied people, professors and so forth, to explain what's going on in the world and the deeper things about the world, they will inevitably turn to sociologists, because the sociologists will always tell a good story. And moreover, they will tell a story that's interesting, an interesting narrative about something which is going on. It's empirical, and it doesn't confuse people, because it leaves this whole setup of subject, object, consciousness, subjects with consciousness, and then the mind is confused with the brain and all this stuff. It's no danger to the media, and it's welcomed by the media, because the media must not challenge their viewers or their listeners, because they will switch off. They will simply switch off. I don't understand it. This is abstract.
Yeah.
So in German, I listen quite a bit of German radio, and it's the reporter, the person behind the microphone interviewing someone, will say to whoever they're interviewing, they'll say, and what does that mean concretely? Because this horror against anything which is abstract, which is too elementary, too simple to really get you can't really get your fingers around it, to hold on to it. Well, what does it mean to talk about the subjectivity of the subject? I mean, what? It's not a fact. It's not a fact that you can find in the world anywhere. It's thinking, and we can only live in the world as humans because we have already cast it into a certain caste within which beings can show themselves as the beings they are. And so for me, it's a matter of questioning the tenability of these, especially of today's caste of subject and objects, and of asking, what has it overlooked? What elementary problems has it overlooked? And saying, well, with this very, very elementary question of, what does being mean itself? And what does it have to do with time itself? Ask this question. It's been on the agenda for 100 years, and very few want to touch it. Very few want to touch it. But I think this opens the way to recasting. It actually loosens things up and gives us a chance to rethink these things and say, maybe the human isn't a subject at all. Can be understood, our human being could be understood from a conception of the psyche instead of a conception of consciousness. What does that mean? You know, what's the difference between psyche and consciousness?
Yes.
Yeah. What I mean, these are elementary questions and they're hard to even approach. And as I say, you know, with the closing off of the ontological difference, there's no way of approaching them from within mainstream philosophy because they've got a tin ear. Yeah.
I love where we started and where we ended today. I know that is one of the fundamental things I took away from talk one, which was this object subject. And I don't mean you corrected me, Michael, but you did say, Katina, you know, when we're not subjects, right? But we see this in ethics review board applications. We see this with human research ethics and clinical trials. It's always about the human subject and the harm and the risk, the vulnerability, dependencies, and all of these things that have to do with ethics. But I think you're right. I really do. You know, the machine world, we do talk about the interaction between a human and a subject. We actually draw that out in data flow diagrams, in entity relationship diagrams, in other diagrams, in software design. And I think this is the wrong language because it goes back to the human capital bit. You know, if we believe the human is a subject, then human capital therefore follows, and it's fine. There's not a problem with that definition because it just follows one from the other. And I thank you for identifying that. I also thank you for something special. I think that you've given me an insight personally, and that is this past, present, future, but also something that perhaps I wasn't exactly aware of, that the same event that's in the past today can mean something very different to us than it did at the time of its happening. That's been an amazing learning, you know, to connect that and then just, oh my goodness, that's right, you know, because I had a student who was in my first ever lecture that was recorded at the University of Wollongong just about a week ago say to me, I really hope, you know, I keep referring to this first lecture. He's now a lecturer at a university in Australia. He said, I keep referring to my students about the first lecture you gave and that I was sitting in the back row. Do you have footage of the lecture? Now, he wasn't sitting exactly in the back row. Amazingly, we found this footage, but he was sitting 4 rows from the back. And I said to him, look, you are still at the back. It's just our mind sometimes tells us we're in the back row, but maybe we're in the 4th last row. But the moral of the story is how we perceive an event and how we now reflect back on it is very important. I mean, the philosophers or the futurists call that backcasting or now casting and future casting. They've sort of added the word casting to this, and they study people. But they often, I think, have too much faith in their predictions of the future. And so I think in the school I'm part of, the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, it's like, what's going to happen tomorrow? But I think I love one particular group in there. That's the Center of Science and Imagination, because it's more about what do we want to imagine? What world do we want to build? Where are we going and how are we going to make that happen? And you haven't explicitly said this today, but I think we're transitioning from this one size fits all, this global view. We're always going to be global. We're one Earth. We're in this one Earth together. And what we do in China impacts what happens in Germany, what happens in Australia. You know, we're all impacting. These forces are impacting one another. But I am thinking we're going to get back to communities of care and communities of practice and communities looking after each other locally, where we're introducing perhaps what used to be more older models, but in a new way. So the care element that seems not to be there as much as it could be in local communities, You know, we come together during devastating events or disasters or something. But we shouldn't just come together for that. We should be together. I know that sounds perhaps too, you know, let's be all one happy family. But in fact, I think we're going to be moving our tech models as they continue to break down and become more fragile. We're going to be moving tech models to this new community level, this community of practice. Do you have any final thoughts? Something you wanted to say and didn't have a chance to say, Michael, today, or anything?
I think I've said pretty much all I had in mind. But going back to your question about ethics, I think it would be really fruitful for ethics to think about its own foundations, to ask some very simple questions about, say a heretical question, say, what is the ontology of ethics? I mean, it doesn't make sense in usual terms, because you've got ontology as a part of metaphysics on the one hand, and you've got a separate branch over here called ethics. Mm-hmm. And they are separate branches. You know, how, what do they have? What is ontology? I mean, what do ethics have to do with the casting of the being of human being? The being of human being. This, to us, is very foundational, elementary questions. And I think in going back, all science and all thinking, all philosophy only makes progress. It only ever takes a step forward by going backwards. That is, it's going backwards to revise what has been and has shaped how we are today. But in going back, we may be able to get a foothold in there to do some recasting. And I take this word cast, and it's a word, it's a concept I take from Heidegger. In Heidegger, it's Entwurf. But I give it another twist. I say, I translate it as cast as a noun, but entwerfen, or as a verb, you can say casting is to throw. Casting is to put into a mold. You cast a piece of cast iron, or you cast a statue, a bronze statue. And you also have in English this wonderful idea of casting into a role. So the players on a stage, or the actors in a film, you are cast into a role. And I like to emphasize this threefold meaning of cast as having a kind of richness. And the idea of recasting, that we can rethrow, that is, we can envisage an alternative, and we can envisage it in such a way that we give a cast to how the being of beings, that is ourselves and also things around us in the world, are cast as such and such, and not merely as objects, and we not merely as subjects. And thirdly, this casting into roles, that we have the possibility of playing roles as players in interplay with each other. And this is a different angle. It's not interaction between subjects. It's interplay between players. Yeah, so I think ethics could do a little bit of soul searching.
It sure can. And Michael Eldred, can I say thank you for this time? You know, you have a message of hope. If I extrapolate anything out of what you talked to us about, you may not have received this compliment previously, but I feel it is a message of hope, of the recasting. I think we're recasting ourselves every day, or we should be trying to, perhaps in a positive way, continue to shed light on things and share and be part of this movement together, interconnected, this interplay, as you call it, and not always for monetary gain. As we said, people need shelter, they need to eat. Obviously, money is important, but this thing of having too much choice as well, do we really need 52 stations? There's a famous song by Bruce Springsteen, 52 channels and there's nothing on, and MG Michael often quotes it because it's the illusion of choice, But you've got this message of hope, and I do believe that younger people are going to be listening to you and going, who is this Francis Bacon? Who is this Heidegger guy? Who is, Karl Marx? And, they're not encouraged to study philosophy. So I thank you for reaching a new audience. I thank you for participating again in the International Symposium on Technology and Society, where I think you're going to have many follow-ups. Part one of this particular series that we're working on has already received hundreds and hundreds of downloads. I believe the message is getting out there, So thank you for your time, your knowledge, your sharing, and for giving us a message of hope.
Yeah, and thank you very much for inviting me to have a chat with you, and also an opportunity to speak to students who will watch this, because I think it's maybe it'll trigger something.
I think it's going to definitely trigger in me. So thank you, Michael Eldred. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, Katina. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Bye.